It was supposed to be just another ordinary day, or so I thought. I was out of town in Phoenix, visiting a client. The meeting had gone well, and I was finishing up some paperwork in a quiet conference room when my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen and saw Linda's name. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a routine check-in, maybe asking how long I'd be or reminding me to pick something up on my way home. I stepped out into the hallway and answered casually, "Hey, what's up?" Then her voice hit me, cold and almost smug. There was no greeting, no small talk, just, "Mark, I'm divorcing you." "Oh, and I've already sold our apartment. Alistair and I are moving in together. Good luck finding a new place." She ended it with a laugh, as though she'd just told me a joke. For a moment, the world tilted. It felt like hearing someone talk about your life as though you weren't even there. Divorce. Alistair. The apartment. Her words hit me hard, each one more jarring than the last. But in that split second, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. I forced my voice to stay calm, my tone as neutral as I could manage. "Sounds good," I replied, as though she had just mentioned changing the brand of coffee we buy. Her silence was brief, but I could feel it. She had expected outrage, maybe even pleading. Instead, I gave her indifference. But inside, it was anything but. Anger, hurt, disbelief. These feelings churned inside me. 6 years of marriage, and this was how it ended. Over a phone call, her voice echoed in my mind. "Alistair and I are moving in together." Alistair, the boyfriend I didn't know existed until 5 seconds ago. She had been lying to me for months, maybe longer, and now she had the audacity to laugh about it. But what hit me hardest was the apartment. It wasn't just walls and furniture. It was everything we had built together. Every inch of that place held memories, late-night talks, arguments, laughter, dreams, and now she had sold it, just like that, without even telling me. I took a deep breath, my grip tightening on the phone. But she wasn't done. "You probably think you're going to fight this, Mark," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "but it's done. The paperwork's signed, and Alistair and I are moving on. Maybe you should too." "Got it," I said simply, still refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. I hung up before she could say anything more. Standing there in the hallway, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. My wife hadn't just decided to leave me. She had planned it with such calculation that I almost had to admire her nerve. Almost. But admiration was the last thing I felt. What I did feel, though, was resolve. She thought she had outsmarted me, that she held all the cards. But Linda didn't know everything. She didn't know about the quiet move I had made months ago, when we refinanced the apartment. She didn't know the deed was solely in my name, and that was her first mistake. I returned to the conference room, sat down, and stared blankly at the paperwork in front of me. My mind wasn't on the client anymore. It was back home. In that apartment I now knew she and Alistair were planning to turn into their new home. The betrayal stung, but beneath it, something else was building. Determination. I wouldn't let her take everything from me. I wouldn't let her laugh her way into a new life while I scrambled to put mine back together. No, Linda didn't realize it yet, but she had just handed me the upper hand. As the rest of the meeting dragged on, I kept a poker face, nodding at the right moments and offering polite responses. But my mind wasn't here. It was already plotting, preparing. By the time I walked out of the building, I wasn't the same man who had answered that phone call. I was ready to fight. Ready to show Linda and Alistair exactly what happens when you underestimate someone who's been paying attention all along. The flight home couldn't come fast enough. The plane ride was uneventful, but my mind was anything but calm. Linda's words replayed in my head over and over, each one like a hammer pounding away at the walls of our shared history. The betrayal itself stung, but what really hit me was her sheer arrogance. Selling the apartment, the one thing that had been our dream, our first big milestone as a couple. She did it without a second thought, as if she had erased me from her life with a single stroke of the pen. But here's the thing about Linda. She never bothered to read the fine print. She was always the type to skim through agreements, signing them with that same misplaced confidence. She left the details to me, trusting I'd handle everything. Funny, isn't it? The very habit that had frustrated me for years was now my saving grace. Months ago, when we refinanced the apartment to get a better interest rate, I made a quiet, calculated decision. At the time, it seemed like a practical move. With the new terms in place, it made sense to transfer the deed into my name alone. I didn't think twice about it. It was just one of those things you do to simplify paperwork. Linda didn't object. In fact, she barely glanced at the documents before signing. I never mentioned it again because, honestly, there was no reason to. It wasn't a secret, just a small detail that hadn't mattered until now. Linda's arrogance had blinded her to the situation's reality. She thought she could sell the apartment, walk away with the money, and leave me in the dust. What she didn't realize was that the deed, the one legal document that determined ownership, was in my name and mine alone. As I sat on the plane, staring out the window at the clouds, I couldn't help but smile. She had sold something that wasn't hers to sell, and while I was furious at her betrayal, there was a sense of satisfaction in knowing I held the upper hand. When I landed and turned my phone back on, there were no messages from Linda, no smug follow-ups or taunts. She probably assumed I was too busy wallowing in self-pity to respond. Little did she know, I was preparing for the fight of my life. My first call wasn't to her. It was to Grace, my lawyer and an old college friend. I had helped her move into her first apartment years ago, and she used to joke that I'd get the family discount if I ever needed her services. Now, it seemed, was the time to cash in. "Mark?" Grace answered. "What's going on? You don't usually call me during work hours." I explained everything, the phone call, the apartment, and Linda and Alistair's delusions of grandeur. By the time I finished, Grace was silent for a moment, then laughed, a sharp, incredulous laugh. "She sold the apartment?" she repeated. "Does she even know she can't legally do that?" "Apparently not," I said, a hint of amusement creeping into my voice. Grace's tone turned serious. "Well, this is going to be interesting. First, we'll need to notify the buyer that the sale is void. If Linda has already taken their money, that could open up a whole can of worms. Fraud charges for starters." The word fraud sent a surge of satisfaction through me. Linda thought she had outsmarted me, pulling the rug out from under me, but in her haste to start her new life, she'd overlooked one crucial detail. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "For now, gather everything. Emails, documents, anything related to the refinancing and the deed," Grace said. "I'll handle the legal side. But Mark, if she's bragging about this to you, she's probably told others too. She's digging her own grave, and we just need to give her a push." I hung up, feeling lighter than I had in days. The betrayal still stung, but knowing Linda's plan was crumbling gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt since that phone call. When I got home that evening, I wasted no time. I pulled out the deed, the refinancing paperwork, and every email exchange tied to the apartment. Each document felt like a small victory, a reminder that Linda's carelessness would be her undoing. I stacked the papers neatly on the dining table, then sat back and stared at them. This wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about taking back my life and showing Linda that I wasn't the pushover she thought I was. She thought she had one, that she could walk away with everything and laugh at my expense. But Linda had severely underestimated me, and soon she would realize the huge mistake she'd made. The drive back to the apartment felt surreal. I spent the whole flight planning what I'd say, how I'd handle the confrontation. Linda had no idea what was coming. That thought gave me an odd sense of calm. For once, the power wasn't in her hands. The moment I walked through the door, I felt it. The apartment was different. Her presence hung in the air, but not in the familiar way. No, this felt different, as if she had claimed the space as her own and erased me from it. I heard her voice before I saw her. She was in the living room, chatting animatedly with someone. I turned the corner and froze. There she was, standing next to a man I assumed was Alistair. He was younger than I expected, tall, smug, with that kind of confidence that comes from thinking you've won a prize. Linda saw me first, and her smile faltered for just a second before she forced it back in place. "Oh, Mark, you're back," she said, her tone dripping with false cheer. Alistair glanced over at me, and I swear he smirked. He actually smirked, as if I were some minor inconveniences in his new life. "I didn't realize you'd be home so soon," Linda continued, her voice now carefully neutral. "Alistair and I were just discussing some plans for the apartment." Plans for my apartment. The audacity of it almost made me laugh, but I didn't. I just stepped further into the room, set my bag down, and looked at both of them. "Linda," I said, my voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Her smile wavered. "Mark, can it wait? We're kind of in the middle of something." "No," I said, crossing my arms. "It can't." Alistair shot a glance at her, then turned back to me. "Look, man," he said in a patronizing tone, "I get that this is hard for you, but Linda and this doesn't concern you." I cut him off, my gaze never leaving Linda's. The room fell silent. I pulled the deed from my back pocket and held it up, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "What's that?" Linda asked, her voice now tight. "It's the deed to this apartment," I said, my tone steady. "The one that's in my name. Only my name." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her usual confidence gone. "After we refinanced, I had the deed transferred to my name," I explained, letting the words sink in. "You signed the paperwork without reading it, remember?" I paused, letting the gravity of the situation hang in the air. "So, no, Linda. You didn't sell this apartment. You can't sell something you don't own." Alistair's smirk disappeared. He turned to her, confusion and irritation written all over his face. "Is this true?" he demanded. "Of course not," she snapped, though her voice wavered. She turned back to me, her eyes narrowing. "You're lying." I didn't bother to argue. I simply set the deed on the coffee table in front of them. Alistair picked it up and scanned the document. His expression darkened as he realized the truth. "Linda," he said slowly, "what is this?" She sputtered, her confidence gone. It's nothing," she said, trying to dismiss it. "He's just trying to scare us." I let out a dry laugh. "Scare you?" "Linda, I'm just getting started. The sale you made? It's void. The money you took? If you've spent a single cent of it, you're looking at fraud charges." Her face went pale. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I countered, stepping closer. "Go ahead. Call your buyer. See how they feel about being scammed." Alistair stepped back, holding up his hands. Whoa. Fraud? Scammed? I didn't sign up for this." He glanced at Linda, his tone turning accusatory. "You told me this place was yours, that you had already sold it." "It is," she insisted, her voice growing more frantic. "I mean, it was supposed to be." Alistair shook his head, backing away. "I'm not getting involved in this mess," he muttered. I crossed my arms, watching their carefully constructed facade crumble. "Here's how this is going to go," I said, addressing both of them. "Linda, you're packing your things and leaving. And you too, Alistair. You don't belong here, and I'm done playing nice." "You can't do this," Linda hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "This is our home." "No," I replied firmly, "this is my home, and you're not welcome here anymore." Alistair, no longer needing any persuasion, grabbed his coat and headed for the door. He shot one last cold look at Linda. "Good luck," he said, before leaving. Linda turned to me, her eyes burning with fury. "You're going to regret this," she spat. I met her gaze unwavering. "No, Linda. You're the one who's going to regret it." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. For the first time in days, the apartment felt like mine again, and that was just the beginning. Alistair's departure was satisfying, but I knew this chaos wasn't over. Linda, as predictable as ever, wouldn't slink away quietly. Still, the sight of Alistair's smug confidence unraveling in front of me was almost poetic. When he finally realized the tangled mess Linda had dragged him into, his arrogance had quickly shifted to confusion and frustration. Watching him crumble under the weight of her lies felt almost like justice. Let's rewind for a moment. When Alistair first walked in with Linda, he carried himself like he owned the place. His every move exuded arrogance, as if he were certain he'd won the prize. I'd seen men like him before, those who confuse boldness for power, thinking they've outsmarted the world, only to find themselves standing on quicksand. But when I revealed the truth about the deed, his transformation was instant. His eyes flickered with doubt as he scanned the document I had laid out. His expression tightened with each line he read. By the time he looked up, his confidence was completely gone, replaced with something far more satisfying: panic. "Linda," he said, his voice strained and low. "What is this?" Linda, true to form, tried to bluff her way out of it. "It's nothing, Alistair. He's just trying to mess with us. Don't fall for it." But Alistair wasn't buying it anymore. He wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, but even he could piece it together. The legal jargon on the deed, my calm and steady demeanor, Linda's desperation. It all painted a picture he couldn't ignore. "You told me this place was yours," he said, his voice rising. "You said you'd already sold it. Was that a lie?" Linda glared at me venomously, as though somehow it was my fault. "It wasn't a lie," she snapped at him, but her voice faltered. I didn't know the deed was in his name." "Okay, it's a technicality." "Technicality?" Alistair scoffed, holding up the deed. "This says he owns the apartment outright." "That's not a technicality, Linda. That's fraud." The word hung in the air like a ticking time bomb. Linda's face drained of color, her bravado slipping away completely. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "You planned this, didn't you? You knew I'd try to sell it, and you just sat there, waiting to humiliate me." I raised an eyebrow. "You're giving me far too much credit, Linda." I didn't plan anything. You did all this yourself. Alistair was clearly fed up. You didn't tell me any of this, he snapped at her. You said you had everything under control. Do you even realize what kind of position this puts me in? I can't be involved in something like this. You're not involved, Linda screeched, her voice shrill. This is between me and Mark. Really? Alistair shot back. Because I'm standing in the middle of his apartment, holding a deed that says I have no business being here. Sounds pretty involved to me. I couldn't help but interject. He's not wrong, Linda. Fraud charges aren't going to look good on anyone's record. And if you've already taken money from the buyer, well, this situation isn't going to end the way you think. Alistair, his frustration boiling over, ran a hand through his hair. He looked at Linda, his face reflecting the crushing realization that the perfect life he thought he'd started was already falling apart. I'm out, he said sharply, stepping away from her. Linda's eyes widened. What do you mean you're out? I mean I'm done, he shot back. This isn't what I signed up for. You lied to me, and now you're dragging me into your mess. Figure it out on your own. With that, he grabbed his coat and walked out, leaving Linda behind. She scrambled after him, her voice pleading. Alistair, wait. Don't go. We can fix this. Just give me a chance to. He didn't even look back. The door slammed behind him, leaving her standing there, stunned. For a moment, I thought she might actually cry. She turned back to me, her face a mix of rage and despair. Are you happy now? She spat, her words sharp with anger. You've ruined everything. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I didn't ruin anything, Linda. You did that on your own. You lied, you schemed, and now you're facing the consequences. Maybe it's time you start taking responsibility for your actions. Her anger flared, but she had no response. She stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I could hear the sounds of her tossing things around, muttering angrily under her breath. As I stood there, the silence after Alistair's departure was almost peaceful. Watching him realize the truth and walk away was the final touch to an already satisfying confrontation. Linda had overplayed her hand, and now she was left to pick up the pieces alone. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was truly in control. The game wasn't over, but the tide had definitely turned in my favor. That night, Linda's anger could have powered a small city. I could hear her pacing in the bedroom, throwing things and muttering curses. The sound of hangers clattering and her suitcase thumping onto the bed didn't bother me. I sat in the living room, enjoying the silence between her outbursts. I had already won this round, and we both knew it. Alistair's dramatic exit had left her rattled, and for the first time since that smug phone call, Linda wasn't in control. It was my turn now, and she hated every second of it. After what felt like an hour, Linda burst out of the bedroom, her face flushed, her expression twisted with frustration. You think you've won, don't you? She said, her voice sharp and accusing. I leaned back on the couch, arms crossed. Linda, this isn't a game. This is my life. You're the one who decided to turn it into a circus. She let out a bitter laugh. Oh, please, don't act like some innocent victim here. You knew about the deed. You planned this. You've been waiting for a moment like this to rub it in my face. I shrugged, refusing to take the bait. You didn't care about the details, Linda. You never have. I didn't need to plan anything because your arrogance did all the work for me. You signed the paperwork without even reading it. That's not on me, that's on you. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and for a moment, I thought she might scream. Instead, she took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. Fine, she said, her tone dripping with venom. You've made your point. Congratulations. What do you want, Mark? Do you want me to beg? Is that it? I raised an eyebrow. Beg? No, Linda. I don't want anything from you. I just want you to leave. You and your grand plans for this apartment can find somewhere else to play house. Her face twisted with fury, but beneath it, I could see panic rising. Real panic. She had underestimated me, and now she was scrambling. You can't just kick me out, she said, her voice trembling. I have nowhere to go. Then I suggest you start figuring it out, I replied, my tone calm but firm. This is my home, and you're no longer welcome here. She stared at me, her lips trembling as she tried to find a response. Finally, she let out a frustrated growl and stormed back into the bedroom. Moments later, she emerged with a suitcase in tow. You're going to regret this, she said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. I met her gaze with steady resolve. No, Linda, you're the one who's going to regret this. You thought you could sell this apartment, take the money, and waltz off into the sunset with Alistair. Now look at you. No apartment, no money, and no boyfriend. She flinched at my words but didn't say anything. She just stood there, her hands tightening around the handle of her suitcase. I'll give you a few days to figure out where you're going, I continued. But make no mistake, you're leaving. The sooner, the better. Her eyes burned with fury, but she didn't argue. She turned on her heel and dragged her suitcase out the door, slamming it behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. Linda was in panic and was desperate. But now, she was gone. The apartment, my apartment, felt lighter without her. I knew this wasn't the end. Linda wasn't the type to give up easily, and I fully expected her to try something else. But for now, I had one, and that was enough. I sat back on the couch and allowed myself a small smile. She thought she could bulldoze her way through my life, but she hadn't counted on one thing. Me. I wasn't the naive, trusting husband she thought I was. I was done being her pawn. Now, for the first time in a long time, I was finally free. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet, after Linda left. Her absence was like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in weeks, the tension that had been hanging over me like a storm cloud began to lift. I stood in the living room, looking around at the remnants of the life we had built together. It was strange how something that once felt so permanent could now feel so foreign. But I wasn't one to dwell on the past. Linda had underestimated me, and I wasn't about to waste this opportunity to take full control of my life. This wasn't just about reclaiming my home. It was about reclaiming myself. The first thing I did was pack up her things. I didn't want her energy, her entitlement, or her lies lingering in my space any longer. I grabbed a few empty boxes from the closet and began sorting through Linda's things. The process was oddly calming. Each item I packed away felt like shedding a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying. Her shoes, haphazardly left by the door, boxed. Her collection of designer handbags, boxed. The framed photos she insisted on hanging in the hallway, despite my dislike for them, down they came. I didn't break or damage anything, not out of kindness, but because I wanted to handle this with dignity. Linda had already brought enough chaos into my life. There was no need to stoop to her level. Once her things were packed up, the apartment felt different. The clutter, both physical and emotional, was gone. It was just me now, in a space that was finally mine. I called Grace next. She'd been my rock throughout all of this, and I knew she'd have the next steps in mind. "How's it going over there?" she asked, her tone a mix of professionalism and sympathy. "Quiet," I replied. "Linda's gone. For now, at least." "Good," Grace said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Let's keep it that way. I've already notified the buyer about the voided sale. They're not happy with Linda, but they're fully cooperating with us. It makes things much easier." "What about Linda?" I asked. "She's in a tight spot," Grace replied, a subtle satisfaction in her words. "If she's already spent any of the deposit money, that's on her. And if she tries to fight back, we move forward with fraud charges." The word fraud still gave me a satisfying chill. Linda had always believed she was untouchable, that she could manipulate and bulldoze her way through anything. Now, she was learning the hard way that actions have consequences. "Do we need to do anything else right now?" I asked. "For now, just hold your ground," Grace said. "Make it clear that the apartment is yours, and you won't tolerate any more nonsense from her. I'll handle the legal stuff, and we'll move forward with the divorce paperwork soon." I thanked her and hung up, feeling more grounded than I had in weeks. Grace was right. This was my home, and I wasn't about to let Linda or anyone else take it from me. With that resolve in mind, I began reclaiming the space. The oversized gaming chair Linda hated, I dragged it into the living room and placed it by the window, where I could enjoy the view. The minimalist artwork I loved but she dismissed as boring, back on the walls. I rearranged the furniture, shifting everything to reflect my tastes rather than hers. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about making the apartment feel like mine again. By the time I was done, the space looked and felt entirely different, cleaner, brighter, more personal. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was my sanctuary, my starting point for the next chapter of my life. Later that evening, my best friend Ethan came over with a bottle of bourbon. He took one look around and let out a low whistle. "Wow," he said, sinking into the couch. "This place looks different." "It's mine now," I said simply, pouring us both a glass. Ethan raised his glass in a toast. To taking control and kicking toxic people to the curb. I clinked my glass against his, a small smile on my lips. To fresh starts. As the night wore on, the weight of the past few weeks began to lift. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. Taking control of the apartment was only the beginning. I was ready to move forward and build a life that was entirely my own. Surrounded by good company and the quiet satisfaction of victory, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just reclaiming a space, I was reclaiming myself. The days after Linda left were a whirlwind of closure and clarity. For all her threats and drama, I knew Linda wasn't going to accept the end quietly. True to form, she tried everything to claw her way back into control: calls, emails, and even surprise visits to the apartment. Each attempt was a desperate bid to salvage a situation she had already lost. Her tone swung between pleading and accusatory. One day, her voicemails would beg for another chance. "Mark, we can fix this. It doesn't have to end this way. You know I didn't mean for things to get so messy." The next, they would be venomous. "You're being petty, Mark. I hope you're happy ruining my life." I didn't respond, not once. The days of entertaining her manipulations were over. Each call, each message, was just another reminder of why I was better off without her. Alistair's fallout with Linda had only made things worse. After discovering the full extent of her lies and the legal mess she'd created, he had completely distanced himself. She was on her own now, and the isolation was clearly driving her to desperation. Grace, ever the professional, kept me informed about the legal proceedings. "She's panicking," Grace said during one of our calls. "The buyer isn't pressing charges, but they're furious. Linda's burned every bridge she had, and now she has no leverage. Mark, you're walking away clean." Hearing those words felt like a heavy weight lifting off my shoulders. For years, I had felt trapped in a marriage where I was constantly second-guessed, dismissed, and taken for granted. Now, with every legal step finalized, I could feel the chains breaking. When the divorce papers arrived for her signature, Linda tried one last attempt to stall. She sent a long email filled with excuses and half-hearted apologies, trying to paint herself as the victim. She claimed she had acted out of fear and felt neglected in our marriage. It was almost laughable. But the best part? Grace's airtight preparation meant Linda couldn't delay for long. A few weeks later, she finally signed the papers. Just like that, it was over. The day the divorce was finalized felt like the end of a long, grueling marathon. I stood in the middle of my apartment and let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The space felt lighter, freer, like it had been purged of all the negativity Linda had brought into it. That evening, Ethan came by again, this time with takeout and another bottle of bourbon. "So, it's official?" he asked, leaning back on the couch. "It's official," I said, pouring us each a glass. "To freedom," he said, raising his glass with a grin. "To freedom," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. The days that followed were filled with small victories. I continued reclaiming the apartment, turning it into a space that truly reflected who I was. The gaming setup Linda hated was front and center in the living room. The artwork she called boring proudly displayed on the walls. I even bought a new couch, one that felt like it belonged in my home, not ours. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to appease someone who never appreciated me. I was living for myself, and it felt damn good. One evening, as I was sorting through old paperwork, I came across a photo of Linda and me from the early days of our marriage, back when things still felt hopeful. We were smiling, arms around each other, looking like a couple who had it all figured out. I stared at the photo for a long moment. There had been good times, sure, but they were buried under years of neglect, manipulation, and betrayal. That photo was a snapshot of a life that no longer existed, a life that had ended long before the phone call that changed everything. I slipped the photo into an envelope and tucked it away in a drawer. I didn't want to throw it away, but I wasn't ready to see it every day either. It was a part of my past, but it didn't define me. The apartment had become more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of my resilience. I had fought for it, stood my ground, and come out on top. It reminded me that I was capable of reclaiming not just my space, but my life. In the weeks that followed, I started planning for the future. The divorce had closed one chapter, but it also opened the door to endless possibilities. I didn't know exactly what the next step would be, but I knew one thing for certain. It would be on my terms. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Free from Linda. Free from her lies. Free from the weight of a marriage that had been dragging me down. That night, as I sat on my newly purchased couch, a glass of bourbon in hand and the city lights twinkling outside, I couldn't help but smile. This was my life now. Simple, peaceful, and entirely mine. The weeks following the divorce felt surreal. like waking up from a nightmare and realizing the sun was finally shining again. The legal battles were over, Linda was out of my life, and the apartment, my sanctuary, had become a symbol of everything I had fought to reclaim. But what came next was something I hadn't expected: peace. It was the kind of peace that came with knowing I had survived something that could have broken me. But not only did I survive, I thrived. I rebuilt, one small step at a time, and each step brought me closer to a life that felt entirely my own. I started with the apartment. It wasn't just about redecorating. It was about turning the space into a reflection of who I was, without Linda's influence. The oversized gaming chair I loved, but she loathed, had a new home by the window, where I could sit and look out over the city while losing myself in a good game. The minimalist artwork Linda had once dismissed as boring now adorned the walls again, and I had splurged on a new couch, a sleek, modern piece that perfectly matched the fresh vibe of the apartment. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was deeply emotional. Each change I made symbolized a step toward reclaiming my identity. The apartment, once a shared space filled with compromise and resentment, had become mine. My sanctuary radiating warmth, freedom, and endless possibility. One evening, while reorganizing a closet, I found a box of old photos. Among them was one of Linda and me from the early days of our marriage. We were smiling, arms around each other, looking like a couple with everything figured out. I stared at the photo for a long moment, struck by how different the man in the picture felt from who I had become. Back then, I thought I understood love and partnership, but hindsight had stripped away those illusions. I slipped the photo into an envelope and tucked it in the back of the closet. I wasn't ready to throw it away, but I didn't want to keep it out either. That part of my life, painful as it was, had shaped who I was now. It wasn't about holding on to the past, but acknowledging it as a reminder of how far I'd come. With the apartment fully reclaimed, I turned my attention to the future. For years, I'd put my own dreams on hold while trying to save my marriage. Now, with nothing holding me back, the possibilities felt endless. I set new goals: personal, professional, and recreational. I signed up for a cooking class, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. I reconnected with old friends I had drifted from while living under the weight of my marriage. Ethan, my best friend, was there through it all. One evening, we sat on the balcony with a bottle of bourbon, talking about everything and nothing. "You know," he said, raising his glass, "I've got to say, man, you're glowing these days. The single life suits you." I laughed, taking a sip of my drink. "It's not about being single," I replied. "It's about being free. For the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm living under someone else's rules." "To freedom," Ethan said, clinking his glass against mine. "To freedom," I echoed, smiling. The divorce hadn't just ended my marriage. It had opened the door to a new chapter, one where I called the shots. The resentment, the self-doubt, the constant feeling of being trapped. They were all gone, replaced by a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years. The biggest change, however, wasn't just the apartment or my new hobbies. It was my mindset. I'd always thought of myself as someone who avoided confrontation, someone who kept the peace at all costs. But this experience had shown me I was stronger than I ever realized. Linda had underestimated me. She thought she could bulldoze her way through my life, take everything, and leave me in the wreckage. But she was wrong. Her arrogance had been her downfall, and my quiet resilience had been my victory. One day, while scrolling through emails, I saw a message from her. The subject line read, "Can we talk?" I didn't even open it. Whatever she had to say didn't matter. My focus was forward, not back. Life didn't change overnight, but little by little, I built something new. The apartment had become a haven, filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The friendships I rekindled reminded me of the importance of surrounding myself with people who truly cared. And through it all, I learned to trust myself again. For years, I doubted my instincts, second-guessed every decision, and let someone else's needs overshadow my own. But now, I knew better. I knew what I deserved, and I wasn't willing to settle for anything less. The night everything finally felt complete was quiet and unremarkable in the best way. I sat on my new couch, a glass of wine in hand, watching the city lights twinkle outside the window. The apartment was warm and inviting, a true reflection of me. I thought about everything Linda had said during our last conversation, the arrogance, the condescension, the smug certainty that she had won. I couldn't help but smile. She thought she was walking away with everything, but in reality, she left with nothing. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of a life I hadn't known I could have, one filled with possibility, peace, and the freedom to be exactly who I was meant to be. For the first time in years, I felt truly, completely free. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.